Her granddaughter said, "She always overstays her welcome." Loud enough for the entire family to hear, Margaret Cole, widow and grandmother for over 30 years, didn't flinch. Sophie, the granddaughter she'd once hosted every summer, thought the remark would be forgotten. By morning, the deed to the lake house and the only set of keys would rest solely in Margaret's hands. She'd been both family matriarch and caretaker. Now she was the guardian of her own legacy. And when Sophie came back for what she thought was hers, the locked door would answer for her. "I'm curious. Where in the world are you joining us from? Drop your city or country in the comments and make sure you're subscribed for all the latest updates." He stood up with that smug look on his face, glass raised, and said, "To her last one." The words hung in the air like a careless slap. Annette felt them land, sharp and deliberate, even as the chandelier's soft light glowed across the table. For a moment, no one moved. No clink of forks, no murmur of conversation, just the quiet weight of something that didn't belong in a toast. Ethan stood there, posture easy, navy jacket buttoned, one hand cradling the wine glass as though he were the honored guest. He held her gaze for a beat, smiling just enough to make it look innocent. A ripple of awkwardness ran around the table. Claire's eyes found the bouquet of roses at the center and stayed there, fixed. Luke, Ethan's son, ducked his head, stabbing at the half-eaten steak as if it might rescue him from hearing more. Annette's lips curved into a gracious smile, practiced over decades of birthdays, fundraisers, and dinner parties. But under the gloss, the sting was already spreading. Last one. As though her life was winding down in a way he'd already decided for her. "Thank you, Ethan," she said evenly, the crystal stem cool between her fingers, her voice. It was steady, but she tasted the bitterness of metal on her tongue. Someone, her cousin Mabel, offered a weak laugh. "Well, here's to 75 more," she said, but the attempt fell flat. The table shifted back into conversation, like a machine that had skipped a gear, still running but rough. Annette leaned back, watching her son slip into a story from work, one that gave him the chance to speak louder, dominate the room again. This wasn't new. It was the same Ethan who had brushed off her opinions on selling the lake cabin, who had once joked in front of strangers about her forgetful old lady moments. A man who still believed the hierarchy of the family placed him comfortably above her. The server approached, her black vest crisp, hair pulled into a perfect bun. She reached for the empty plates, but Annette held up a hand. "Wait here just a moment," she said softly. The young woman nodded, stepping aside, tray balanced against her hip. Annette glanced at Ethan. He was leaning toward Claire, whispering something that pulled a tight, practiced smile from her lips. The sound of his laughter was like a knife turned slowly, sharp but controlled. Inside, Annette felt the slow burn of something dangerous. Not rage, not yet, but the unshakable decision that this moment, here under the glittering light, would be the last time she swallowed his disrespect without answer. She slid her hand into her purse, feeling the familiar edges of the ivory envelope resting inside. Her lawyer had sent it last month, updated and notarized. She'd kept it close ever since. The conversation swelled again, punctuated by forks and glasses, but she wasn't listening anymore. She was counting her breaths, timing the moment. She'd learned long ago that decisive acts are most powerful when they arrive quietly, almost without warning. Her thumb traced the smooth paper. The envelope was heavier than it looked, weighted with her signature, her terms, and the authority to change the balance of the room forever. Annette turned toward the server, her expression calm, and placed the envelope firmly into her hand. "See that this goes to the office," she murmured. Then she straightened, her gaze fixed on Ethan as the server stepped away, the will leaving her grasp like the first stone in an avalanche. The silence that followed Ethan's toast wasn't just awkward, it was the weight of years of hurt. It lingered over the table like an unwelcome guest, heavy and unblinking. Forks moved with unnecessary precision, glasses were sipped without a word, and every polite murmur carried the brittle sound of people pretending nothing had happened. Ethan had turned away from her, giving his attention to the server pouring more wine. Claire stared at her plate, tracing the rim of her fork through the last smears of gravy. No one dared to meet Annette's eyes. She let her gaze sweep the length of the table. On her left, Luke was slouched in his chair, mumbling something to his cousin about baseball tryouts. On her right, Mabel was already buttering a second roll, as if carbs could soak up the tension. The chatter was patchy, lifeless, stripped of the warmth it once carried. Annette remembered other birthdays, when the room leaned toward her stories, when her laughter set the tone for the night. There was a time she'd been more than the family's ornament. Now she was treated like fine china on display, looked at but not touched, not truly engaged with. She sipped her water slowly, the condensation slick against her fingers, and tried to place the exact moment things had shifted. Was it after her husband's death? After Ethan started taking charge of the family finances? Or had it been a gradual erosion, one sarcastic comment at a time, until her place had been quietly reduced to the corner seat at her own table? A low chuckle from Ethan pulled her focus. He was leaning toward Mabel now, telling some story about a client at work. His voice had the same easy rhythm it always did when he was the center of attention, as though his earlier remark hadn't been a deliberate cut. Annette's patience thinned with every tick of the restaurant's grandfather clock. She studied each face around her, some feigning distraction, others pretending to enjoy the pie, and realized the same truth over and over. Not one of them had stood up for her. She pressed her napkin to her lap, folding it into a neat square. If this was the new order of things, her dignity quietly chipped away while the rest of them looked on, then she had no interest in playing the silent matriarch any longer. When the coffee was served, she excused herself, murmuring something to Mabel about the restroom. Mabel barely nodded, more focused on her dessert than on her departure. The hallway outside the dining room was cool, lined with framed black and white photos of the restaurant's early days. Annette's heels clicked softly against the tile as she walked past them. In the reflection of a darkened window, she saw herself, hair immaculate, pearls catching the light, and thought how strange it was that she looked exactly as composed as they expected her to be. The car ride home was no warmer. Ethan kept his eyes on the road, hands steady at 10 and 2. Claire scrolled through her phone, face lit by the screen, saying nothing. The hum of the tires filled the silence like static. At her driveway, Ethan pulled up without ceremony. "See you Sunday," he said flatly, before pulling away. Annette stood under the cold wash of the porch light, watching the taillights vanish. The air was crisp enough to sting her lungs, but she took her time with each breath. Inside, her house greeted her with its usual quiet, the faint scent of lavender sachets, the slow tick of the clock in the hall. She moved through the rooms without switching on lights, fingertips grazing the smooth edges of furniture, as if reacquainting herself with the contours of her own space. When she reached her study, her eyes went straight to the bottom right drawer of the desk. She lowered herself into the leather chair, the seat sighing under her weight. Her hand rested on the drawer pull for a moment, her heartbeat slow but deliberate. The room felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls were waiting for her to move. With one clean motion, she opened the drawer, revealing the crisp envelope of her will. Her fingers lingered on its edge as she murmured, "It ends here." This wasn't just about inheritance. It was my way of taking control back. The envelope lay on the desk, its edges precise, the weight of it far greater than paper should allow. Annette's hand hovered over it before she eased it open, careful not to tear the flap. Inside, the pages smelled faintly of ink and the faint tang of the legal office, a scent that reminded her of signatures, notaries, and the quiet satisfaction of binding things in black and white. She smoothed the document flat, her eyes tracing each familiar clause. She'd read it before, of course, had written it with deliberate care years ago, but tonight the words felt different. They hummed with a sharpness she hadn't noticed before, each line a thread woven into the safety net she'd built for herself. Midway down the second page, she found it. The condition she had fought to include when the will was last updated. If Ethan failed to treat her with respect and deference in public and private matters, his share of the estate would be revoked. At the time, her attorney had raised an eyebrow, warning her it was a little unusual. She'd insisted. Now it felt less like an eccentric flourish and more like the anchor she'd been waiting to drop, her lips curved, not in amusement, but in something colder, steadier. This wasn't about punishing him over one smug remark at a dinner table. It was about every time he'd spoken over her, dismissed her, diminished her in front of others. It was about the quiet erosion of her place in her own family. She reached for the phone. The old landline still sat in the corner of her desk, the coiled cord slightly kinked from years of use. Punching in the number from memory, she listened to the low, even hum of the ring. "Margaret Holt," came the crisp voice on the other end. "It's Annette," she said. "I want to review my will. Specifically, the condition about Ethan." There was a short pause, then the rustle of papers. "Ah, yes. Paragraph 11, subclause 3. Margaret's voice was steady, factual. "It stands exactly as you intended, ironclad as long as I'm your counsel of record." "And if he contests it?" Margaret's tone didn't waver. "Then we contest back. Your documentation is thorough. Witnesses signed. Dates are in order. He'd have to prove the clause was unreasonable, and, frankly, I doubt a court would see it that way." Annette closed her eyes briefly, letting the words sink in. Ironclad. There was power in that word, the same kind of quiet power she had learned to cultivate in her life. Never loud, but unyielding. When she hung up, the house seemed different, lighter somehow. She walked to the window, looking out at the empty street. The moon hung low, washing the yard in pale silver. Somewhere across town, Ethan was probably unwinding, convinced the evening was over, the sting of his toast already fading. He had no idea she'd just shifted the ground under his feet. Annette returned to the desk and sat. Her pen was right where it always was, in the brass holder. She tapped it against the blotter, the rhythm settling her thoughts. Confronting Ethan would not be pleasant. Claire would try to smooth it over, maybe even play mediator. But there would be no mediation, not this time. She opened a fresh sheet of stationery, the heavy cream kind she reserved for serios. The pen hovered over the page. She thought of all the words she could use, sharp, precise words to slice through the years of posturing. But for now, it was enough to begin. The rest would come. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed softly, marking the hour. The sound reminded her of evenings long ago when she'd been the one calling the shots, hosting dinners, making decisions, setting the tone. She could feel that woman stirring again. She set the nib to paper, the first line spilling out in her firm, even script. "Ethan, this is not a request." He thought it was a joke, until the truth hit him like a hammer. Ethan strolled into her living room as though the invitation had been for coffee and idle chatter. Claire followed a step behind, her coat draped neatly over her arm, eyes already scanning the familiar photographs on the mantel. Annette gestured to the armchairs opposite hers. "Sit," she said, her tone free of preamble. The will rested on the low oak coffee table between them, the ivory paper crisp against the dark wood. Ethan glanced at it and smirked. "What's this, Mom? You redoing your estate plans already?" He dropped into the chair, sprawling back as though to make himself larger. Annette didn't answer immediately. She picked up the will, flipped to the second page, and began reading, her voice steady, deliberate. The phrasing was legal, exact, but every word landed with the precision of a chisel striking stone. When she reached the clause, she paused. "Should my son, Ethan James Parker, fail to treat me with respect and deference in both public and private matters, his inheritance shall be revoked in full." She set the pages down, her gaze never leaving his. Ethan chuckled, a short, dismissive sound. "Come on, Mom. This is family. You can't actually mean this. We're talking about Sunday dinners and the occasional ribbing, not, this isn't ibbing," she cut in. Her voice had a steel thread in it now, one he hadn't heard from her in years. "It's a pattern, and patterns have consequences." Claire shifted in her seat, her polished nails catching the light as she twisted her wedding band. The air between them felt tighter by the second. "Mom," Ethan said, his smile thin now, "you're really going to turn this into some kind of legal crusade? Over a toast?" "It's not about one toast," Annette replied. "It's about the years of little cuts you've made and expected me to laugh off." Her fingers rested lightly on the will. "And I won't have it anymore." She leaned forward, her tone dropping. "This isn't a threat. It's a fact. I have the power to revoke every cent you think is guaranteed to you. Every cent." Ethan's smirk faltered, the color in his cheeks darkening. "You wouldn't?" "Try me." Claire glanced at him, her lips parting as if to speak, but then she looked down at her lap instead. Her silence said enough. She'd felt the shift, too. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Ethan's eyes were locked on hers, but there was something new in them. Calculation. Maybe even uncertainty. "Mom," he said finally, "this is extreme." "No," she said, rising to her feet. "It's overdue." Claire leaned toward him, whispering something too low for Annette to catch. His jaw tightened. Annette picked up the will, slid it back into its envelope, and placed it on the mantel beside the family photographs. "You don't get to disrespect me and still expect to inherit," she said. "Not anymore." Ethan's face darkened, his posture losing its casual sprawl. Claire's whisper turned rapid, urgent, her eyes darting between them. Annette stood unmoving, watching the words coil around him, knowing the next thing out of his mouth would tell her everything she needed to know. Ethan thought it was all just a joke, but the truth hit him in front of the whole family. The dining room at Mabel's house was crowded, voices weaving together in a patchwork of Sunday chatter. Silverware clinked against china, and the scent of roast chicken and rosemary floated in the air. Annette sat at the far end of the table, spine straight, hands resting lightly on the linen tablecloth. She had chosen her seat deliberately, close enough to command the room, far enough to see every face when the moment came. Ethan was in his usual position mid-table, leaning back with a glass of red wine in hand, playing the storyteller. His voice carried above the others the way it always did when he wanted an audience. Claire, beside him, kept her focus on slicing a piece of bread into careful, unnecessary halves. Annette waited until the conversation swelled, the kind of noisy warmth that makes a room feel full. Then she tapped her spoon against her water glass, once, twice, 3 times. The chatter quieted, heads turning. "I have an announcement," she began, her voice steady, deliberate, "regarding my will." That was enough to hush the rest of the table. Even Mabel froze with a serving spoon halfway to her plate. Annette drew a folded paper from her handbag. "The terms have been updated," she continued, scanning the room. "Any beneficiary who fails to treat me with respect in both public and private will forfeit their inheritance. This is effective immediately." The silence was thick enough to feel. Her eyes found Ethan. "That includes you, Ethan." He blinked, the corners of his mouth twitching into a smirk that didn't quite stick. "Mom, we don't need to." "I do," she cut in, "because I've allowed far too much for far too long." Around the table, reactions rippled. Her cousin Helen gave a small nod, lips pressed tight in quiet approval. One of the younger nieces sis, her lip staring down at her plate. Others shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Ethan's smirk faltered. The flush that had been good-natured moments ago darkened into something closer to embarrassment. He cleared his throat but said nothing. Annette let the silence stretch, her gaze holding him in place. "Consider this a line drawn," she said. "Cross it and there will be nothing for you to inherit." Claire's eyes dropped to her lap. She didn't speak, but her fingers worked at her napkin until it was a wrinkled ball. Annette sat back, letting the weight of her words fill the space. She could feel her own resolve hardening, solid as stone. This wasn't about theatrics. It was about reclaiming the respect she'd been denied, even if it meant fracturing the image of a polite, conflict-free family gathering. The meal resumed in slow, awkward motions. Forks lifted, glasses were sipped, but the air never regained its earlier warmth. Every now and then, she caught someone stealing a glance at her or at Ethan, as if gauging who would speak next. When dessert was served, Ethan stayed quiet, his usual dominance in the conversation replaced by clipped replies and a tight jaw. Annette felt no triumph in it, only a clear-eyed understanding. Power, once reclaimed, often came at a cost. As she reached for her coffee, her phone buzzed against the table. She glanced down. The text was from Margaret Holt. "We have a new complication. Call me tonight." The phone call wasn't what I expected. It shook me to my core. The house was still when she returned, the kind of stillness that made even the tick of the clock sound loud.